Hi guys, and welcome to Bedtime History Relaxing. Tonight we are stepping into something so ordinary that you probably never really think about it, and yet so powerful that it quietly shaped empires, determined trade routes, and even decided who lived and who did not across thousands of years. You are going to follow the long-hidden history of salt, those tiny white crystals you sprinkle without a second thought, as they slowly reveal themselves as one of the most important forces in human civilization. And yes, there is a good chance you would not survive very long in many ancient worlds without it. Even though you probably think of it as just a seasoning on your food, you are here now, in a calm, dim space, maybe lying down, maybe sitting back, and as your eyes grow heavier, imagine the earliest humans doing something very similar, but with far more urgency. They are not thinking about empires or trade or chemistry. They are thinking about survival, somewhere in the distant prehistoric world. You watch them notice something strange. White crusts form near dried lakes, or along the edges of evaporating pools. Animals gather there obsessively, licking the ground, returning again and again. Early humans observe this behavior carefully, because in their world, nothing is random. Every pattern matters. Every repeated action of nature carries meaning. A mainstream historical fact is that sodium chloride is essential for regulating hydration and nerve function in the human body, something modern science confirms with precision. But in these early landscapes, nobody knows anything about ions or electrolytes. They only know that when they consume certain foods or lick certain minerals, their strength returns and their bodies feel less weak. That simple observation slowly becomes one of humanity's earliest steps toward understanding invisible chemistry, even if no one has words for it yet. You walk with them through dusty valleys where salt deposits glimmer faintly under sunlight. The air feels dry, almost sharp in the throat. Your feet crunch on mineral crusts that have formed over centuries of evaporation. These places are not farms or cities. They are accidental laboratories of nature, created when water disappears and leaves behind its memory in crystalline form. Early humans do not name it yet, but they are already beginning a relationship with it that will last for millennia. There is also a quieter, more curious detail that does not always appear in formal history books. Some anthropologists suggest that early human groups may have followed animal migration routes not just for hunting, but specifically to locate salt sources, almost as if they were reading an invisible map drawn by necessity. You can imagine small groups moving seasonally, not fully understanding why certain places felt important, only that returning to them meant survival. Scholars still argue whether salt was a primary driver of early migration or just one of many overlapping factors, but the idea itself reveals how deeply this mineral is tied to the movement of life. Now picture the moment of first deliberate collection. You are there with them as someone bends down, scooping white crystals into a crude pouch made of animal hide. There is hesitation at first. Anything unfamiliar in nature carries risk, but then comes taste. That sharp, clean intensity hits the tongue and something changes. Not pleasure exactly, but recognition. The body understands before the mind does. This is needed. As you continue walking through this early world, salt begins to shift from accidental discovery into intentional gathering. People start returning to the same places. They begin to mark routes in memory. These are not roads yet, but they are becoming pathways of meaning, and with every return, salt becomes less of a curiosity and more of a necessity. Without it, preserved food spoils faster. Without it, fatigue sets in more quickly. Without it, entire groups weaken over time. You might notice how quietly this transformation happens. There are no announcements, no written records, no grand declarations, just repetition, just survival, and slowly. Salt becomes one of the earliest invisible threads connecting human groups across geography. A widely recognized historical understanding shows that salt later became a cornerstone of early trade systems. But at this stage, there is no trade yet, only gathering, sharing, and learning. Still, the seeds of exchange are already forming. If one group knows a location rich in salt and another does not, knowledge itself becomes valuable, and wherever knowledge becomes valuable, exchange is not far behind. In the background of this slow evolution, nature continues its own quiet work. Seas evaporate under sun, lakes shrink season by season, wind carries fine mineral dust across open land, salt is everywhere, but not evenly distributed, and that unevenness is what gives it power over human history. You might find it interesting how something so common today once required such careful attention. Even the smallest mistake in early salt gathering could mean wasted effort or missed opportunity. And yet, humans persisted. They always do. Because once the body understands something essential, it rarely forgets it. Historians still argue whether early salt use was primarily dietary or more strongly linked to food preservation in prehistoric societies. What is clear, however, is that salt becomes increasingly central as humans begin storing food for longer periods. That ability alone changes everything. It allows movement beyond immediate seasons. It allows survival beyond local scarcity. And it quietly lays the foundation for future civilizations. Now, as you settle deeper into this narrative, imagine the soundscape around you fading into something softer. The wind across dry land, the distant movement of animals, the faint crunch of the mineral beneath bare feet. Everything feels slow, almost suspended. You are at the very beginning of a story that will stretch across continents and thousands of years, but right now it is just a few humans, a few discoveries, and a substance that seems simple until you realize it is shaping the future in silence. And as your thoughts begin to drift a little more gently, you can almost sense how this small white crystal is already preparing to travel beyond survival, beyond necessity, and into something far larger than anyone here could ever imagine. You are still in that quiet, early world, but now something subtle has changed. The discovery phase is fading, and what begins to emerge is pattern. Not yet civilization, not yet organized trade, but something far more instinctive. You're no longer just watching humans find salt, you're watching them begin to revolve around it. The landscape shifts beneath your awareness. Dry riverbeds stretch into the distance, cracked earth reflecting harsh sunlight. Somewhere nearby, animals gather again in clusters, drawn to mineral-rich ground. You notice that humans are no longer randomly encountering these places. They are returning, learning, remembering. That act alone, memory tied to survival geography, is already a quiet revolution. A mainstream historical fact is that salt licks naturally form in mineral-rich regions where groundwater brings dissolved salts to the surface, creating persistent locations that attract both wildlife and humans for thousands of years. These sites become ecological anchors, shaping movement patterns long before agriculture or cities exist. You stand with early groups observing this phenomenon without understanding its geological cause, only its consequence. You watch as humans begin to recognize that salt is not evenly distributed. That realization changes behavior in a fundamental way. It introduces direction into their movement. Before this, migration was reactive, following water, following herds, following seasons. Now there is something else layered on top of survival. Intentional return, a quiet form of mapping the world. As you walk with them across this ancient terrain, you start to notice how animal behavior becomes a guide. Deer, bison, wild goats all move toward the same mineral patches. Early humans watch closely. They are learning not just from their own bodies, but from the bodies of other species. It is an early form of ecological intelligence built through observation rather than instruction. A quirky detail preserved in some anthropological interpretations suggests that certain prehistoric groups may have treated salt-rich earth as almost sacred ground, not because of spirituality in the modern sense, but because of repeated association between those locations and physical recovery. After consuming salt-rich materials or following animals to these sites, fatigue lessened, strength returned. Over time, repetition can resemble meaning. Scholars still argue whether this interpretation reflects actual belief systems or modern projection onto ancient behavior, but the pattern of reverence-like behavior at mineral sites is difficult to ignore. Now imagine yourself walking further with them. The air becomes warmer, heavier. You arrive at a shallow basin where water collects after rare rains. Weeks later, it evaporates completely, leaving behind a thin crust of white crystals. This is not just salt, it is a transformation of the landscape itself. Water disappears and leaves behind memory in solid form. Early humans may not think in those terms, but they are witnessing it all the same. They begin to scrape the surface more deliberately now, not just tasting, but collecting. Small tools made of stone are used to gather and store the crystals. The act is no longer accidental, it is structured. Even if simple, it is already behavior shaped by expectation. Return to the same place, expect the same outcome. You might notice how this changes the rhythm of life. Camps are no longer only set near water or shelter, they begin to appear near reliable salt sources. That decision alone subtly reorganizes human geography. A group that stays near salt has an advantage in food preservation and physical endurance. Over time, advantage becomes stability, and stability becomes influence. There is also a quieter transformation happening inside the human body itself, though no one understands it yet. When salt intake is too low, fatigue increases, muscles weaken, cognitive clarity declines. Early humans only know the feeling, not the cause, so salt is not just a preference, it becomes a corrective force, something the body demands with increasing urgency the longer it is absent. Historians still argue whether early salt dependence influenced the development of long-distance seasonal migration routes, but many agree that salt sources likely acted as fixed points around which early movement patterns stabilized. These points become invisible landmarks in memory long before maps exist. As you continue observing, something else begins to appear. Sharing at first. Salt is collected for immediate group use, but soon, groups encounter each other at these mineral sites. Encounters are tense at first. Competition is natural, but over time, something more complex emerges. Exchange, not formal trade yet, but gestures of access, permission, and negotiated presence. You can almost feel the social tension in these spaces. Two groups arriving at the same salt pool, watching each other, waiting, sometimes conflict, sometimes silence, sometimes cautious sharing. In these moments, salt is not just a substance, it is leverage. It is a reason to communicate with strangers in a world where strangers are usually dangerous. A widely recognized historical understanding shows that resource concentration is one of the earliest drivers of structured social interaction in human history. Salt deposits, because they are rare and localized, become natural catalysts for this process. You're watching the earliest form of negotiation emerge, not in markets or cities, but in quiet mineral fields and open ski under. Picture the evening light now. Shadows stretch long across cracked ground. The group you are with has gathered what they can carry, small bundles of white crystals wrapped in hides or leaves. There is a sense of completion, but also anticipation, because they already know they will return, not out of curiosity, but necessity. And in that return lies the beginning of something larger than survival. Repetition becomes habit, habit becomes root, root becomes network, and network, in time, becomes civilization. As night approaches, the world softens again. Fires flicker in small clusters. Salt is stored carefully nearby. Not yet understood as power, but already treated as essential. You can hear quiet voices, low and rhythmic, blending with the sounds of wind moving across empty land. And as you begin to drift with them into that early rhythm of life, you realize something simple but profound. This story is not just about salt. It is about how a single recurring need can slowly teach humanity where to go, what to value, and how to stay together long enough to become something more than scattered survival. The world around you shifts again, but not in any dramatic way. There are no sudden revolutions, no visible turning points that announce themselves. Instead, everything feels like a slow tightening of patterns, as if human life is gradually learning where to settle its weight. You are still in the deep prehistoric rhythm, but now salt is no longer just a place or a discovery. It is becoming a behavior, something that organizes movement, memory, and survival in increasingly predictable ways. You find yourself following a group moving along a familiar route. The ground is uneven, shaped by the seasonal water flows that have long since disappeared. Dry grasses bend under light wind. The sun feels high and indifferent. Yet this group does not move randomly anymore. Their path curves with intention, looping back toward unknown mineral sites, water sources, and hunting grounds. Salt is quietly embedded in their decisions, even when it is not being spoken about. A mainstream historical fact is that sodium chloride plays a critical role in maintaining nerve signaling and muscle contraction in the human body, which modern physiology explains in precise biochemical terms. But here, in this early world, none of that language exists. Instead, there is only lived consequence. When salt is present, bodies endure longer journeys when it is absent. Exhaustion arrives sooner and recovery takes more time. These repeated experiences slowly shape human movement across entire landscapes. You begin to notice something subtle but important. Salt is not only being collected at natural deposits anymore. It is being revisited with purpose. The same locations appear again and again in memory, almost like fixed stars in an otherwise shifting world. Humans start to recognize that these places are reliable, even if they do not yet understand why. Reliability, in a fragile existence, becomes power. As you walk with them, you pass shallow inland basins where water once pooled, but now only leaves behind faint white residue after evaporation. These are not dramatic landscapes. They are quiet, almost overlooked features of geography. Yet they are becoming central points in human life. Around them, you see signs of repeated visits, scraped earth, disturbed crusts, faint trails leading in and out like threads woven into terrain. A quirky detail often discussed by anthropologists is that some early cultures may have associated salt deposits with animal intelligence rather than natural processes, believing that herds deliberately sought out certain good grounds and following them with a sense of borrowed wisdom. Whether this reflects belief or interpretation is still debated, and scholars still argue whether such patterns represent early symbolic thinking or simply practical observation. Either way, the outcome is the same. Humans learn to trust the geography of salt. Now imagine the group pausing at one of these sites. The air is dry, almost still. You hear only the faint sound of tools scraping mineral crusts. These tools are simple, shapestone fragments used to break and gather the white deposits. There is no ceremony here, no ritual language. But there is attention, focus, a quiet understanding that this material is worth effort, repetition, and careful collection. Over time, this behavior begins to change how space itself is organized. Camps are not just temporary shelters anymore. They start to align with access. If a salt site is nearby, a group may stay longer in one region. If it is far, they may plan longer journeys with greater coordination, without anyone naming it. Salt is beginning to influence territorial logic. A widely recognized historical understanding shows that early resource concentration often leads to the formation of stable movement corridors, long before formal trade systems exist. In this case, salt becomes one of the earliest invisible architects of human geography. You are watching the slow birth of pathways that will later become roads, and eventually, trade networks spanning continents. There is also something happening inside the human social structure. You begin to see subtle differences in how access to salt is managed. Not everyone gathers equally. Some individuals become more experienced, more trusted, better at locating deposits or negotiating access with neighbouring groups, without formal hierarchy yet. Expertise begins to emerge, and where expertise exists, influence quietly follows. You move through a small gathering where salt is being distributed among members of the group. There is no currency, no formal exchange system, yet there is still a sense of value. Portions are measured not by weight, but by need, by status, by contribution. Even here, before writing or markets, you can feel the earliest outlines of economic thinking forming in human behaviour. Historians still argue whether salt should be considered one of the primary catalysts of early proto-economic system, or whether it simply accelerated processes already driven by broader survival needs. What is clear, however, is that wherever salt is abundant and unevenly distributed, human interaction becomes more structured, more negotiated, and more dependent on memory of place. As you continue walking, the landscape begins to open into wider plains. The horizon feels distant, almost softened by heat. In these spaces, salt is less visible on the surface, but its influence remains. Groups plan routes based on knowledge of where mineral-rich areas lie beyond visible landmarks. Knowledge itself becomes portable, carried in memory from generation to generation. You might notice how this transforms storytelling within groups. Instructions about safe routes, reliable water, and salt locations are passed down orally. These are not myths yet, but they are beginning to carry weight beyond simple instruction. Repeated knowledge becomes tradition. Tradition becomes identity. A mainstream historical fact is that early human societies relied heavily on oral transmission to preserve environmental knowledge, long before the development of written language. In this context, salt locations likely became part of essential survival narratives, repeated so often that they gained a rhythm similar to storytelling. You are now standing at the edge of that transformation, where practical information begins to sound like memory shaped into narrative. The sun begins to lower again. Shadows stretch across the ground, softening the harshness of the terrain. You can feel how the day cycles around this group's movements. Morning for travel, midday for gathering, evening for return and sharing. Salt quietly sits within all of it, not as the centre of attention, but as a constant background force guiding decisions. And as you settle deeper into this rhythm with them, you realize something important. No one here is chasing salt as a concept. They are simply responding to need. Yet through that need, entire patterns of human life are being drawn into shape. Movement, memory, cooperation, even early forms of social structure all begin to align around something as simple as a white mineral crust on the dry earth. As night approaches once more, the group rests. Small bundles of salt are stored carefully, protected from moisture and loss. Fires flicker softly. The world feels quiet again, but beneath that quiet is an invisible structure slowly forming, one that will eventually connect distant lands, shape economies, and define power. For now, though, it is just you, this fading light, and a landscape slowly learning how to be organized by something as simple and as essential as salt. You are no longer just observing scattered survival patterns. Something more structured is beginning to form in the human relationship with salt, something that feels closer to intention than instinct. The world is still ancient, still shaped by raw land and seasonal uncertainty, but human behavior is slowly tightening into recognizable systems, and at the center of it, quietly, almost invisibly, salt continues to guide movement and decision. You move with a group across terrain that is no longer just wilderness in the simple sense. It is becoming mapped in memory. Certain valleys are avoided, others are revisited, and a few rare places are treated with almost cautious respect. Among them are salt-rich zones where the earth itself seems to offer stability in an otherwise unpredictable world. A well-established historical finding shows that early human settlements often formed near resource sources that provided both dietary and preservation advantages, with salt-bearing environments playing a crucial role in long-term habitation patterns. You can see this logic unfolding in real time here, even though no one is consciously articulating it. People simply stay longer where survival feels easier. The group pauses near a shallow depression where mineral crusts shimmer faintly under angled sunlight. The surface is cracked and layered, shaped by repeated cycles of water appearing and disappearing. You crouch with them, watching as simple stone tools scrape through the brittle surface. The sound is dry, almost rhythmic, like the landscape itself is being gently broken into form. There is something interesting happening in how attention is distributed. Not everyone is gathering salt equally. A few individuals are beginning to develop reputations for knowing where to find it, how to recognize the right ground, how to distinguish usable deposits from useless residue. These early forms of expertise are not formal roles yet, but they are becoming socially visible. One lesser-known observation from anthropological studies is that in several prehistoric contexts, resource-gathering sites appear to have functioned as informal meeting points where knowledge exchange occurred alongside collection activities. You can almost feel that here. Groups do not just take salt and leave, they observe each other. They remember who arrives early, who finds the richest patches, who knows the land best. As you continue walking with them, the landscape subtly changes again. Dry river channels widen into open basins, the air feels hotter, and the ground reflects light in uneven patches where mineral deposits have surfaced. Salt is no longer confined to a few isolated spots. It is part of a broader ecological rhythm shaped by evaporation, rainfall, and geological layering. You begin to notice how human movement is adjusting around this rhythm. Instead of random wandering, there is now seasonal anticipation. Groups seem to expect where resources will appear based on past cycles, even without formal calendars. Time is being read through environmental repetition. Salt deposits become part of that reading, like recurring sentences in the language of the land. A commonly accepted interpretation in historical anthropology is that predictable resource locations played a foundational role in stabilizing early migratory behavior, allowing human groups to reduce risk by returning to known environmental points. You are watching that stabilization process unfold step by step. Each return to a salt site reinforces memory, and each successful gathering strengthens the decision to come back again. Now imagine a moment of quiet interaction between groups. Two separate clusters arrive at the same mineral basin. There is a pause, no immediate conflict, no immediate cooperation, just observation. Bodies reading bodies. Movement slows. Tools are held loosely, not raised. In this silence, social behavior is being tested and refined. Then something subtle happens. One group shifts slightly to the side, allowing shared access, not generosity in modern sense, but recognition of mutual need. Salt is abundant enough here to allow temporary coexistence. You can feel how these small decisions begin to accumulate into early social norms, even if no one is naming them. There is ongoing academic discussion about whether such shared resource sites contributed more to cooperation or competition in early human societies. Some evidence points to conflict, especially in scarce environments. Other interpretations emphasize repeated peaceful encounters that gradually formed expectations of coexistence. The truth likely sits somewhere in between, shaped by geography and necessity. You move further along with the group, and now the salt is not just something collected from obvious deposits. It appears in subtler forms: thin crusts on soil, faint residues on stones, traces left behind after water recedes. Learning to recognize these signs becomes a skill in itself. Experience begins to matter more than chance. A well-established historical finding shows that early survival knowledge often depended on cumulative environmental reading, where subtle physical cues were used to predict resource availability. You can see this intelligence growing here, not as formal science, but as lived awareness passed through observation and repetition. The group stops again this time. There is less excitement in the gathering. It has become routine, almost expected, and that's important. When something shifts from discovery to routine, it stops being extraordinary and becomes structural. Salt is entering that stage in human life. You notice storage beginning to matter more. Small hides, woven plant materials, or hollowed containers are used to carry collected crystals. Protection from moisture becomes important, not because anyone understands chemical degradation, but because experience has taught them that dampness reduces usefulness. Practical knowledge slowly replaces trial and error. One lesser-known observation from ethnographic reconstruction is that early storage behaviours often emerge first for resources that are both essential and difficult to replace locally. Salt fits this pattern perfectly. You are watching the beginnings of preservation thinking, where humans start planning beyond immediate consumption. As the sun shifts lower again, the group begins to prepare for return. Movement is slower now, not because of exhaustion alone, but because carrying salt changes the rhythm of travel. It adds weight, but also purpose. You can feel how this substance is subtly reorganizing physical effort and group coordination. A commonly accepted interpretation in archaeology is that portable essential resources significantly influence the development of early exchange networks, as groups began to compare access and availability across regions. Even if trade does not yet formally exist, comparison already does. Memory of where salt was found becomes valuable information. You walk with them as the terrain softens into longer shadows. The world feels wide again, but no longer directionless. There is a sense of invisible structure forming beneath everything you see. Paths are not yet carved into roads, but they are being traced in memory, reinforced by repetition and necessity. And as night approaches, the group settles into rest. Salt is stored carefully nearby, not as treasure, but as continuity, something that ensures tomorrow will be possible in the same way today was. The fire burns low, the air cools, and in the quiet space between waking and sleep, you can almost feel how something as simple as a mineral is slowly teaching humanity how to organize time, movement, and survival itself. You drift forward again into a world that feels only slightly more organized than before. Yet the difference is becoming harder to ignore. Human life is still fragile, still dependent on weather, water, and the unpredictable movement of animals, but patterns are now beginning to hold, and salt, once a curiosity on the edge of survival, is increasingly becoming a stabilizing presence in how people think about land and time. You are walking with a group that no longer feels entirely improvised in its movement. Their route carries memory. They pass certain landmarks without hesitation, and others with caution. The landscape itself feels like a living map, not drawn on any surface, but carried collectively in minds that remember where salt appears, where water lingers, and where danger tends to repeat. A well-established historical finding shows that early human groups often developed repeated seasonal circuits between resource sites, forming what researchers describe as mobility loops that predate formal settlement systems. You can feel that looping structure here. The group is not wandering randomly anymore. It is returning, revisiting, reinforcing knowledge through repetition. The ground beneath you changes subtly as you move. Dry earth gives way to faintly reflective patches where minerals rise to the surface. In some places, a thin crust of salt forms naturally, almost like frost trapped in soil. The air is quiet, and even sound feels softened by heat. You notice how the group reacts to these environments with familiarity rather than surprise now. A commonly accepted interpretation in environmental archaeology is that predictable resource zones reduce uncertainty in early subsistence economies, allowing human groups to invest energy in longer journeys and broader territorial awareness. You see this shift in how confidently they travel. Salt sites are no longer accidental encounters, they are destinations. At one stop, you watch as individuals break off small fragments of crusted mineral using sharpened stones. The motion is practiced, efficient. There is no hesitation. What once might have been experimentation has become routine skill. Nearby, others wait with carrying bundles made of hide or woven plant fibre, ready to receive what is gathered. A lesser-known observation from ethnographic parallels suggests that repetitive resource gathering often leads to the emergence of informal roles within groups, especially when certain individuals demonstrate consistent ability to locate or extract materials. Here, you begin to notice that dynamic forming. Some people are simply better at reading the ground, others are better at carrying, storing, or remembering routes. The group does not name these differences yet, but they are becoming socially visible. Recognition is subtle. A glance held a little longer, a tool handed back without question, a suggestion followed without argument. Salt gathering is quietly shaping early forms of trust and authority. You move with them across a wide open stretch of terrain. The horizon feels distant, slightly wavering in heat. In these spaces, salt is less visible on the surface, but its presence is still understood. Knowledge of where it exists beyond sight is what matters now. Memory is becoming more valuable than immediate perception. A well-established historical finding shows that oral transmission of environmental knowledge played a central role in early human survival, particularly in regions where resource distribution was uneven. You can hear that transmission happening here. Not as formal teaching, but as repeated reference. We go there when the water dries, we return after the animals move. These are simple phrases, but they contain structured understanding of landscape cycles. As you continue, you notice that salt is beginning to influence timing as much as location. The group seems aware of seasonal changes in ways that go beyond immediate weather. They anticipate dryness. They expect certain areas to become accessible only after evaporation cycles. Time itself is being read through environmental transformation. There is ongoing academic discussion about whether early resource-based movement systems contributed to the development of proto-calendrical thinking, where recurring environmental events formed the basis for tracking time. Salt deposits, dependent on evaporation cycles, may have played a subtle role in this emerging awareness. You're standing inside that possibility now. At another gathering point, you observe a moment of quiet exchange. Two groups are present again, similar to earlier encounters, but this time the interaction feels less uncertain. There is distance, but also recognition. Each group watches the other's activity. There is no immediate conflict, no sudden withdrawal. Instead, a careful coexistence forms around the shared understanding that this place will provide value for both. A commonly accepted interpretation in prehistoric sociology is that repeated neutral encounters at resource sites contribute to reduced intergroup hostility over time, gradually establishing expectations of predictable behavior. You can feel that gradual softening here, not as peace in the modern sense, but as practical coexistence shaped by necessity. Salt is at the center of this interaction again. It is not just material, it is shared focus, a reason to occupy the same space without immediate confrontation. You begin to see how a simple mineral can structure social distance. how it can create zones of temporary balance between unfamiliar groups. As the gathering continues, you notice how carefully collected salt is handled. It is no longer treated casually, even if no one explains why. There is care in how it is wrapped, stored, and carried. Loss is avoided not through fear of punishment, but through learned experience. If salt is lost, effort is wasted. If effort is wasted, survival becomes harder. A lesser-known observation from archaeological site analysis is that storage behaviours often appear earlier for materials with indirect but essential bodily functions, even before their biochemical importance is understood. Salt fits this pattern perfectly. You are witnessing the early stages of preservation logic forming through repeated consequence rather than theory. The group begins to move again as the light shifts. Shadows lengthen across uneven ground. The landscape feels wider now, almost continuous, as if boundaries between places are becoming less important than connections between them. Salt sites are not isolated points anymore. They are part of a network of remembered locations. A well-established historical finding shows that spatial cognition in early human groups increasingly relied on networked environmental memory, where multiple resource locations were mentally connected through travel experience. You can feel that network forming. It is not drawn anywhere, but it is real in how people move. You walk with them as the day begins to soften into evening. The pace slows slightly, not from fatigue alone, but from the weight of carried materials and the anticipation of return. There is a rhythm now to their life that feels less chaotic than before. Outward movement, collection, return, sharing, rest. Salt is embedded in each phase, and as night begins to approach again, you see the group settle into a familiar arrangement. Fire is gathered. Bundles are placed in safe proximity. Conversations are low and unhurried. Salt is present but unspoken, already absorbed into the structure of daily survival. You realize, as the light fades, that nothing here feels sudden anymore. Everything is accumulation. Every small return to a salt site, every careful collection, every shared moment between groups is slowly building something larger than itself. Not yet civilization, not yet economy, but something that will eventually become both. And in that quiet realization, as the world settles into darkness, you can feel how deeply this simple mineral is beginning to organize human life without ever announcing its presence. The world feels slightly more connected now, as if invisible threads are beginning to stretch between distant places. You are still in an early human landscape, but something important is changing in how distance is understood. It is no longer just space to cross, it is becoming space that can be remembered, repeated, and eventually relied upon, and salt, once again, is quietly shaping that transformation. You are moving with a group along a familiar stretch of terrain, but today the journey feels more deliberate. There is a sense of direction that comes not from markers on the ground, but from memory carried collectively. Someone gestures ahead, not because they see salt, but because they remember it being there in a previous cycle of travel. That memory is enough to guide movement. A well-established historical finding shows that early human mobility was often organized around cyclical resource availability, with groups returning to known extraction sites across seasonal intervals. You can feel that rhythm here. This is not exploration anymore. It is repetition refined into strategy. The land opens into a shallow basin where the earth appears pale and slightly reflective. The surface is uneven, cracked in places, smooth in others. You crouch with them as hands begin to break apart thin mineral layers. The sound is soft, almost delicate, like something being carefully unmade. Salt gathers in small piles, quickly transferred into containers made of hide and woven plant fibers. A commonly accepted interpretation in prehistoric archaeology is that Repeated engagement with specific resource locations leads to early forms of territorial familiarity. Even in the absence of formal ownership systems, you see this familiarity in how the group moves. They know where to step, where not to step, where the ground is likely to yield more. There is no map here, but there is structure. Every movement is shaped by accumulated experience. Even silence carries information, and someone pauses longer at a particular patch of ground. Others notice and adjust. Knowledge is not spoken in full sentences. It is distributed through attention. A lesser-known observation from ethnographic comparisons suggests that early resource-based groups often developed what researchers describe as shared spatial memory. When knowledge of place is collectively reinforced through repeated group travel rather than individual recall alone, you can feel that collective memory functioning like an invisible guide, stronger than any single person's understanding. As you continue walking, the landscape becomes more varied again. Dry ridges rise gently between open flats. The air carries heat in visible waves, yet even here, the group maintains orientation toward known salt points. These locations are not always visible until you arrive, but their existence is unquestioned. They exist in memory first and in sight second. You begin to notice how salt is changing the way effort is justified. Long journeys that might once have seemed unnecessary are now accepted because the return includes something essential. The cost of travel is balanced by the certainty of gain. This is an early form of calculation, not numerical, but experiential. A well-established historical finding shows that early economic behavior often emerges from repeated cost-benefit recognition embedded in survival routines. Long before formal systems of exchange exist, you can see that recognition here. People do not debate whether to come, they remember why they must. At one stop, you observe a quieter moment. While some gather salt, others sit slightly apart, resting and observing the surrounding land. There is no formal division of labour, but roles are becoming more consistent. Certain individuals focus more on extraction, others on transport, others on observation. These roles are not assigned, but they persist through repetition. A commonly accepted interpretation in social anthropology is that task differentiation in early human groups often emerges organically from repeated exposure to environmental challenges, rather than structured hierarchy. You're watching that emergence in its earliest form, not authority, but familiarity shaping responsibility. As the group continues, you pass through a stretch of land where salt is not immediately visible. Yet no one shows concern, they are following memory now, not surface cues. This reliance on remembered geography is becoming increasingly important. It allows movement through areas that would otherwise feel uncertain or empty. There is ongoing academic discussion about whether this kind of memory-based navigation contributed to the development of broader cognitive mapping abilities in early humans. Salt-rich environments, because they require repeated return journeys, may have strengthened this capacity. You're walking inside that cognitive evolution, step by step. Eventually, the group reaches another familiar basin. The reaction is subtle but noticeable. There is a slight easing of tension, a quiet acknowledgement that the journey has succeeded again. Salt is present here as expected, reinforcing the reliability of their memory. You watch as collection begins again. The motions are efficient now. There is no experimentation, only execution. Tools are used with practiced precision. Crusts are broken, gathered, and stored with minimal waste. The process has become embedded in bodily memory as much as mental recall. A lesser-known observation from archaeological field studies suggests that repeated manual engagement with specific material environments often leads to embodied knowledge, where physical actions become automatic through repetition. You can see this embodiment here. The hands know what to do before thought intervenes. As the gathering continues, you notice small interactions between individuals. A container is passed without words. A slight adjustment is made to someone's stance without instruction. These micro-interactions reflect a level of coordination that does not require formal communication. It is built through shared experience. A well-established historical finding shows that early human cooperation was often maintained through implicit behavioral synchronization rather than explicit instruction, particularly in resource-intensive activities. Salt gathering, repetitive and essential, becomes one of the environments where this synchronization strengthens. The sun shifts again, lowering its intensity. Shadows stretch across the basin. The group prepares to leave, but there is no urgency. Departure is as practiced as arrival. Containers are checked, loads adjusted, balance tested. Everything is familiar now, and familiarity reduces risk. You begin to understand that salt is not just a material being collected. It is a reason for coordination, a reason for return, a reason for remembering where to go. It structures not only movement, but also timing and group awareness. A commonly accepted interpretation in environmental history is that stable resource locations contribute to the gradual formation of recurring movement circuits, which eventually evolve into early trade pathways. You're still before trade here. But the circuit is already forming. Invisible lines are being drawn through repeated travel. As the group begins its return journey, the landscape feels slightly different than before, not physically, but cognitively. You start to recognize how every path is layered with memory. Each step is not just forward motion, but reinforcement of previous journeys. The world is being built through repetition, and as evening approaches again, the group settles into the familiar rhythm of rest and storage. Salt is placed carefully among other gathered resources. Firelight flickers softly. Conversations remain low and steady. Nothing about this moment feels dramatic, yet everything about it is foundational. Because what you are witnessing is not just survival anymore. It is structure forming out of repetition, memory turning into geography, and necessity quietly shaping the earliest outlines of human systems. And in that quiet, as the fire dims and the night settles in, you realize that salt is no longer just something humans find. It is something that is slowly teaching them how to organize the world. You are now moving deeper into a world where salt is no longer just shaping movement, but beginning to shape infrastructure in the most primitive sense. Not roads yet, not cities, but something quieter and more foundational. Repetition is starting to harden into structure. Paths that were once temporary are beginning to feel permanent through use alone, and memory is becoming as important as terrain. You walk with a group following a route that feels increasingly stable. The ground underfoot is worn in subtle ways, not carved, but softened by repeated passage. Stones are slightly polished in places where feet have passed countless times. The environment itself is beginning to remember human movement, and at the center of these repeated journeys is the same silent reason, salt. An established historical consensus indicates that early mobility corridors often emerged along resource-rich landscapes, particularly where essential minerals or water sources created predictable return cycles. You can feel that logic in motion here. This is no longer exploration, it is circulation. The group reaches a familiar basin where salt crusts shimmer faintly beneath a thin layer of dust. The light is harsh, but the surface reflects it in broken fragments, as if the earth itself is remembering evaporation. You kneel with them as tools scrape across hardened deposits. The sound is consistent now, almost rhythmic, like a practiced gesture repeated across generations. One intriguing anthropological observation suggests that repeated engagement with fixed resource sites often leads to early forms of environmental anchoring, where specific locations become psychologically fixed points in group memory. You see that anchoring here. Nobody questions why this place matters. It simply does. As salt is gathered, the surrounding behavior becomes more coordinated. People naturally position themselves in roles without instruction. Some scrape, some carry, some watch the surroundings. The efficiency is not planned, but it is real. Repetition has created structure without hierarchy. Evidence remains inconclusive regarding whether early task specialization emerged primarily from environmental necessity or from social adaptation to repeated group cooperation. What is clear in this moment is that both forces are intertwined. Salt gathering demands coordination, and coordination reinforces itself through success. You notice something, Bordio, in how the group interacts with space. Certain areas of the basin are avoided, not because they are dangerous, but because they are less productive. This invisible zoning of space is important. Even without maps, the group is beginning to categorize terrain based on value. Salt has introduced a language of usefulness into geography as you move with them. The basin begins to feel less like a location and more like a node in a wider network. The group speaks less about arriving and more about returning. This shift in language reflects a deeper cognitive change. Place is no longer singular, it is cyclical. Comparative studies in early societies indicate that repeated seasonal return to resource sites often form the earliest foundations of spatial memory systems. Long before formal mapping or writing existed, you are standing inside that cognitive framework as it forms. Each return strengthens the mental outline of the landscape. A small but important moment occurs as someone pauses, noticing a slightly richer deposit in a corner of the basin. Others adjust their position immediately. No words are needed. Attention itself has become a form of communication. This shared sensitivity to variation is a key survival advantage in a world where resources are unevenly distributed. You begin to understand that salt is not just something extracted from the earth. It is something that trains perception. It teaches the group where to look, what to ignore, and how to interpret subtle changes in terrain. Over time, this shapes not just movement, but awareness itself. There is continuing academic disagreement over whether such resource-driven attentional patterns influenced early cognitive development in ways that extended beyond survival. Some interpretations suggest that repeated environmental scanning for salt and similar materials may have contributed to heightened spatial awareness in early humans. You can see the early form of that here in the constant scanning of ground, horizon, and group behavior. The gathering continues with steady rhythm. Containers fill gradually. The weight of collected salt is distributed among carriers. This distribution is not formally assigned, but it follows recognizable patterns. Stronger individuals tend to take more, not by command, but by expectation built through repetition. One subtle observation from field archaeology notes that early transport behaviors often precede formal exchange systems. As carrying and redistribution within groups becomes increasingly structured before any concept of trade emerges. You're watching that stage now. Movement of material is organized, but still internal. As the sun shifts, shadows stretch across the basin, the light softens, and with it, the pace of activity slows. There is no urgency, but there is completion. The group knows when the cycle is finished. This awareness of completion is as important as the act of gathering itself. You walk with them as they prepare to leave. Tools are checked, loads adjusted, and final glances are cast back at the basin. It is not emotional, but it is attentive. Memory is being reinforced again. This place will be returned to. An established historical consensus indicates that early human groups often developed strong spatial memory tied to repeated resource extraction sites, which gradually contributed to the formation of stable movement circuits. You can feel that circuit tightening here. The path is becoming familiar in the body, not just the mind. As the group begins its return, the terrain feels slightly different in perception. The distance is the same, but familiarity reduces cognitive weight. Movement becomes more automatic. Salt has created not just a destination, but a rhythm of travel that feels increasingly natural. Evidence remains inconclusive regarding whether this type of repetitive movement contributed directly to early notions of territorial awareness. However, what is clear is that repeated return creates a sense of belonging to roots rather than places. The path itself becomes meaningful. You notice how silence dominates the journey back. There is less need for observation now, less need for constant adjustment. The environment is known. This familiarity allows attention to drift inward slightly, even as the body continues forward. It is in this drifting awareness that early human reflection may have begun to take shape. Comparative studies in early cognition suggest that repetitive travel through known environments often allows for mental consolidation of experience, strengthening memory structures associated with place and sequence. You are experiencing that consolidation now. Each step feels both new and remembered at the same time. As evening approaches, the group slows again. Firelight will soon define the edges of space as salt is secured among other gathered materials. There is no ceremony around it, no symbolic elevation. Yet its importance is visible in how carefully it is treated, how consistently it is protected. One intriguing anthropological observation suggests that materials involved in both survival and repetition often become early anchors of social stability. Even before symbolic systems assign them meaning, salt fits this pattern quietly, without declaration. And as night settles over the group once more, you realize that something very simple is happening across all these movements. Repetition is turning into structure. Structure is turning into memory. And memory is slowly beginning to organize human life around itself. Salt is not just present in this world anymore. It is shaping how this world is remembered. You are now moving through a world where repetition has begun to feel almost like geography itself. The land is still wild, still shaped by climate and chance, but human behavior is no longer entirely reactive. It is increasingly patterned, and those patterns are becoming strong enough to outlast individual experience. Salt continues to sit at the center of this transformation, not as an object of fascination, but as a quiet reason for return, coordination, and memory. You travel again with the same group, and there is a subtle sense of continuity in their movement. Faces are more familiar now, gestures are recognized without effort, even the silence between individuals feels structured. As if communication has expanded beyond speech into shared understanding built through repetition. The route ahead is not guessed, it is remembered. An established historical consensus indicates that early human groups often developed cyclical movement systems anchored to reliable resource zones, with salt deposits frequently acting as fixed points in seasonal circuits. You feel that system here not as theory, but as lived motion. The group is not searching, it is completing a cycle. The terrain opens into another salt-bearing landscape, though this one feels slightly different. The crust is thinner, more scattered, appearing in irregular patches rather than dense formations. The group does not react with surprise. Instead, they adjust their movement fluidly, spreading out in a practice pattern that maximizes coverage. This behavior suggests familiarity not only with place, but with variation in resource. Resource density. One intriguing anthropological observation suggests that early human groups may have developed adaptive gathering strategies specifically for resources that appear in inconsistent surface distributions, refining spatial awareness through repeated exposure. You can see that refinement here in how quickly individuals read the ground and reposition themselves without instruction. As tools begin to scrape across the surface, the familiar sound returns. It is not loud, but it is consistent enough to become almost meditative. Small fragments of salt are collected and passed along lines of individuals who have already assumed their roles without discussion. Some focus on extraction, others on consolidation, others on guarding the perimeter of activity. Evidence remains inconclusive regarding whether these emerging role patterns represent early social hierarchy or simply efficient coordination under environmental constraint. What is clear is that repetition has produced predictability in behavior. Predictability, in turn, reduces uncertainty in group movement. You begin to notice how attention is distributed across the landscape. While some focus on the immediate task, others scan the horizon. This division of attention is not assigned, but it is consistent. Over time, it has likely proven beneficial enough to persist. Salt gathering, with its stationary focus and predictable return, allows other forms of awareness to develop around it. A commonly accepted interpretation in behavioral archaeology suggests that task environments requiring sustained attention to a fixed location often encourage complementary roles focused on peripheral awareness. You're seeing that dynamic here, where extraction and vigilance coexist naturally. The day progresses slowly. Heat rises from the ground, creating distortions in the air. Yet within this environment, the group remains steady. There is no urgency, only rhythm. Salt is gathered in quantities that feel modest individually, but significant collectively. Each small contribution accumulates into a shared result that reinforces the value of the journey. As you move with them, you begin to sense how deeply salt is embedded in the structure of decision-making. It influences where to go, how long to stay, how much effort to expend, even without explicit calculation. The group behaves as if balancing inputs and outcomes. Experience has become the measure of value. There is continuing academic disagreement over whether early resource-based movement systems should be interpreted as proto-economic behavior or as purely ecological adaptation. Some interpretations emphasize survival efficiency, while others highlight the gradual emergence of exchange logic embedded within repeated interaction. You are witnessing the early ambiguity of that boundary. At one point, the group pauses longer than usual. A section of the ground appears slightly richer in deposits. There is no verbal agreement, but movement subtly shifts toward it. Individuals reposition themselves, not competitively, but responsively. The system adjusts itself through perception rather than command. One lesser-known observation from ethnographic studies is that in early resource-gathering systems, collective sensitivity to environmental variation often functions as a primary coordination mechanism, reducing the need for explicit leadership. You can feel that sensitivity operating here in real time. As the gathering continues, you notice that storage behaviors have become more deliberate. Containers are arranged in a way that suggests awareness of protection and balance. Salt is not simply placed inside materials, it is layered, separated, and distributed carefully to prevent loss during travel. These small actions reflect accumulated knowledge of fragility. An established historical consensus indicates that early preservation practices often develop through repeated observation of material degradation, rather than theoretical understanding of chemical processes. Salt, because of its sensitivity to moisture and handling, would have naturally encouraged careful storage behavior long before its scientific properties were understood. The sun begins its slow descent, shadows lengthens across the basin, and the group gradually transitions from extraction to preparation for departure. There is a quiet efficiency in this shift. No abrupt signals are needed. The rhythm of the day itself provides structure. You walk with them as they gather their loads. The weight of collected salt is noticeable in posture and movement. Shoulders adjust, steps become slightly more measured. Yet there is no sense of burden, only recognition of purpose. This material is expected. It is part of the cycle. One intriguing anthropological observation suggests that physical effort associated with transporting essential resources often reinforces their perceived value within early societies, even in the absence of symbolic systems of exchange. You can see that reinforcement here in how carefully the loads are balanced and protected. The return journey begins, and once again the landscape shifts in perception. Paths that once felt uncertain now feel familiar. Landmarks appear earlier in recognition. The group moves with less hesitation, as if the environment itself is collaborating in their passage. A commonly accepted interpretation in cognitive archaeology suggests that repeated traversal of stable routes contributes to the formation of spatial memory networks, allowing groups to navigate increasingly complex environments with reduced cognitive load. You are experiencing that reduction now. Movement feels smoother, more continuous. Evidence remains inconclusive regarding whether such repeated movement patterns directly contributed to the development of abstract mapping systems in later societies. However, the foundational structure is clearly present here. Repetition is creating internal geography. As evening approaches, the group slows again, transitioning into the familiar rhythm of rest. Fire is prepared, materials are organized. Salt is placed among other gathered resources with careful attention. There is no symbolic elevation, yet its placement suggests importance. It is treated differently, even if not spoken about differently. One lesser-known observation from early material culture studies is that items repeatedly involved in both survival and transport often acquire a form of practical centrality within group organization, becoming reference points for planning and movement. Salt fits this pattern quietly and consistently, and as night settles over the landscape once more, you begin to understand something deeper than the act of gathering itself. This is not just about a mineral being collected from the earth. It is about how repetition transforms behavior, how memory transforms space, and how necessity slowly builds the invisible architecture of human life. Salt is no longer just part of survival here. It is becoming part of structure. You move forward again into a world that feels increasingly structured by repetition. Even if no one here would ever describe it that way, there are no formal systems, no written plans, no deliberate organization of territory, and yet everything you see now carries a sense of continuity. Paths are being reinforced simply because they are used again and again. Memory is thickening across the landscape, and salt remains the quiet reason these cycles persist. You are walking with the group along a route that feels almost familiar enough to be comfortable. The terrain shifts gently between dry flats and shallow depressions, with occasional mineral glints appearing where the ground has been exposed. The air is warm and still, and movement feels less like exploration and more like returning to something already known. An established historical consensus indicates that repeated environmental traversal in early human societies contributed to the stabilization of seasonal movement patterns, particularly in regions where essential resources were unevenly distributed. You can feel that stabilization here. The group is no longer reacting to the landscape, it is working with it. The salt site appears again, but this time your awareness of it is different. It does not feel like a discovery point. It feels like a recurring destination in a cycle that has already been mentally accepted. The group spreads out in a practiced formation without discussion. Some move directly toward the densest visible crusts, while others scan peripheral areas for less obvious deposits. One intriguing anthropological observation suggests that repeated engagement with fixed resource zones often leads to the development of anticipatory behavior, where groups begin to expect environmental outcomes before visually confirming them. You see that anticipation here in how quickly movement begins, even before full assessment of the site. Tools are already in motion, scraping, collecting, transferring. The sound is familiar now, almost rhythmic enough to blend into the environment itself. It no longer signals novelty, it signals process. Salt extraction has become embedded in bodily routine, carried out with minimal hesitation. Evidence remains inconclusive regarding whether such repetitive resource interaction directly contributed to early forms of procedural memory development in humans, but the consistency of movement patterns suggests a strong link between physical repetition and cognitive familiarity. You can feel that link in how naturally each action follows the next. As you move through the group, you notice subtle differences in focus. Some individuals remain close to the most productive zones, while others drift slightly outward. Observing terrain variation. These roles are not assigned, but they are stable enough to be recognizable. Over time, such patterns begin to resemble early functional specialization. A commonly accepted interpretation in behavioral anthropology suggests that repeated cooperative tasks in stable environments often lead to emergent role differentiation, even in the absence of formal hierarchy. You are witnessing that emergence here as a natural consequence of efficiency rather than authority. Salt continues to accumulate in small but steady quantities. It is passed from hand to hand, placed into containers, and occasionally reorganized to balance load distribution. The process is quiet, almost mechanical in its repetition, yet every movement is intentional in its own way. You begin to notice how attention within the group is divided between immediate action and environmental awareness. Some individuals focus entirely on extraction, while others maintain a broader scan of the surrounding terrain. This dual focus allows the group to operate efficiently without losing situational awareness. One lesser-known observation from ethnographic modeling suggests that early collective labor systems often develop complementary attention structures, where different individuals specialize in micro-levels of environmental awareness. You can see this structure forming here without any formal instruction. The landscape itself feels increasingly integrated into human behavior. Certain patches are consistently approached, others consistently avoided. This selective engagement transforms geography into a functional map, even though no visual representation exists. Memory alone defines importance. An established historical consensus indicates that repeated interaction with specific environmental features can lead to cognitive mapping systems that precede formal cartography by thousands of years. You're standing inside that early mapping process now, where knowledge is stored in bodies rather than symbols. As the gathering continues, the group shows signs of efficiency refinement. Movements are shorter, transitions between tasks are smoother, fewer words are needed. This reduction in communication does not indicate absence of coordination, but rather the internalization of shared understanding through repetition. Evidence remains inconclusive regarding whether such behavioral efficiency in early human groups should be interpreted as cognitive evolution or simply adaptive learning. However, the practical outcome is clear. Less effort is wasted. More salt is gathered with fewer disruptions. The sun shifts overhead, marking the passage of time not through numbers, but through light and shadow. The group adjusts pace accordingly, instinctively preparing for eventual departure. There is no formal signal, but there is shared awareness. The cycle is approaching completion. One intriguing anthropological observation suggests that repeated environmental cycles often become embedded in group timing behavior, allowing human groups to synchronize activity with natural patterns without explicit measurement of time. You can feel that synchronization here in how activity begins to taper naturally. As collection slows, attention shifts toward consolidation. Salt is checked, redistributed, and secured. Containers are reinforced. Weight is balanced for travel. These actions are performed with increasing precision, reflecting accumulated experience rather than improvisation. A commonly accepted interpretation in early economic anthropology suggests that consistent handling of portable essential resources contributes to the development of logistical awareness. Long before formal systems of exchange or storage emerge, you can see that awareness here in the careful preparation for return. The group begins to move away from the basin. The transition is smooth, almost seamless. There is no clear break between gathering and departure. It is all part of the same continuous cycle now. Salt defines the rhythm, and the rhythm defines the movement. As you walk with them, the terrain begins to feel increasingly familiar. Landmarks are recognized earlier. Distances feel shorter, not physically, but cognitively. Repetition compresses uncertainty. The world becomes easier to navigate through memory alone. One lesser-known observation from early cognitive anthropology suggests that repeated traversal of stable routes enhances spatial compression in memory, allowing groups to perceive long distances as sequences of familiar segments rather than continuous unknown space. You are experiencing that compression now. The return journey is quieter than the outward movement. There is less observation, less adjustment. The group moves with confidence that comes from familiarity. Salt, now carried in measured quantities, reinforces the purpose of the journey even as it becomes less visible in the moment. An established historical consensus indicates that repeated resource cycles often lead to the formation of stable movement corridors, which later evolve into trade pathways when intergroup exchange becomes more frequent. You are still before that stage, but the structure is already forming beneath the surface of behavior. As evening approaches, the group slows once more. The familiar process of settlement begins. Fire is prepared. Loads are placed down carefully. Salt is stored alongside other gathered materials. The organization of space reflects growing consistency in behavior. One intriguing anthropological observation suggests that materials repeatedly involved in essential survival tasks often become central organizing elements in early domestic spaces, even before symbolic or economic value is formally recognized. You can feel that centrality forming here in the careful placement of salt. And as night settles again, the world returns to quiet. The fire flickers. Conversations remain low and steady. The group rests within a cycle that feels increasingly stable, increasingly predictable. What once required constant attention now operates almost automatically. Salt is no longer just part of survival, it is part of rhythm and through rhythm. It is slowly shaping how human life organizes itself across time, space, and memory. You enter a phase of this long human journey where salt is no longer simply shaping movement or memory, but quietly influencing how distance itself is perceived. The landscape feels wider now, not because it has physically changed, but because the group's understanding of it has deepened. Repetition has turned scattered places into a connected mental system. Every return journey reinforces invisible lines across the world. You walk with them across a broad stretch of terrain where dry earth meets faint mineral residue. The ground looks ordinary at first glance, but those who have travelled here before move with certainty. There is no hesitation in direction. The route exists in their bodies as much as in the land. A widely accepted view in archaeological research suggests that early human mobility often stabilized around recurring resource locations, particularly where environmental conditions allowed predictable regeneration or exposure of essential materials such as salt. You can see this stabilization here, not as theory, but as lived behavior. The group is not searching anymore. It is following memory shaped by repetition. The salt site appears gradually, almost unremarkably, as if it has always been part of the landscape rather than a destination. There is no announcement, no moment of discovery. Instead, there is recognition. People begin to spread out naturally, each moving toward areas they already understand will yield material. One lesser-known observation from comparative anthropology suggests that repeated engagement with specific environmental zones often produces what researchers describe as place familiarity gradients, where certain areas become cognitively prioritized over others based on accumulated experience. You can feel that gradient here in how quickly attention locks onto productive ground. Tools begin their steady work again. The sound of scraping is soft but constant, forming a background rhythm that blends into the wind. Salt is gathered in small, controlled motions transferred carefully from the ground to container. The process feels almost automatic now, shaped by countless repetitions rather than conscious instruction. There is ongoing academic discussion about whether such repeated material interaction should be interpreted as early technological behavior or simply refined survival instinct. What is clear in this moment is that the boundary between instinct and technique is becoming less distinct. The body knows what to do before thought arrives. As you move through the group, you notice how attention is distributed with increasing subtlety. Some individuals focus entirely on extraction, while others maintain awareness of surrounding terrain and group spacing. This layered attention allows efficiency without verbal coordination. Silence itself becomes functional. A commonly supported interpretation in behavioral archaeology suggests that cooperative labor in early human groups often leads to emergent synchronization of attention, where individuals naturally adopt complementary perceptual roles. You can observe that synchronization here, unspoken but reliable. The terrain surrounding the salt site now feels less like wilderness and more like a repeated stage for activity, even when not actively collecting. The group behaves as if it understands this place in advance. Movement is reduced to familiar patterns. Efficiency replaces exploration. One intriguing observation from ethnographic parallels suggests that repeated resource engagement often leads to anticipatory actions and sequences, where individuals begin physical tasks before full environmental confirmation is complete. You see this in how quickly gathering begins upon arrival, as if confirmation is no longer required. Salt continues to accumulate steadily. The quantity is not overwhelming, but it is consistent enough to reinforce the value of return. Each small collection adds to a growing sense of reliability. The group is not just gathering material, it is reinforcing a cycle. There is ongoing academic debate about whether early resource cycles contributed more to cognitive mapping development or to social coordination structures. Some researchers emphasize spatial memory, while others focus on group synchronization. In reality, both seem to be unfolding together in this environment. As the sun moves higher, heat distorts the horizon. Yet even in this shifting visual field, the group remains anchored in task. Movement is calm, practiced, and evenly distributed. There is no urgency because there is no uncertainty. The system has been learned through repetition. A widely recognized interpretation in prehistoric studies indicates that repeated engagement with stable environmental resources often reduces cognitive load in navigation and decision-making, allowing early groups to allocate attention to task refinement. You can feel that reduction here in the simplicity of movement. Occasionally, brief adjustments occur within the group. Someone shifts position, another adjusts spacing, another identifies a slightly richer patch of ground. These micro changes happen without instruction. Coordination is embedded in perception rather than language. One lesser-known observation from cognitive anthropology suggests that shared environmental familiarity can produce nonverbal coordination efficiency, where group members align actions through subtle behavioral cues rather than explicit communication. You're witnessing that alignment continuously. As gathering continues, storage becomes increasingly important in practice rather than concept. Containers are filled with careful attention to balance and protection. There is awareness that loss during transport reduces the value of effort, even without formal understanding. Preservation logic is emerging. A commonly accepted view in early material culture studies suggests that portable essential resources often drive early storage innovation, particularly when those resources are sensitive to environmental conditions such as moisture or contamination. Salt naturally fits this pattern, encouraging careful handling through repeated experience. The group begins to slow as the cycle nears completion. There is no signal, but there is shared recognition. Activity transitions gradually from extraction to preparation for departure. This smooth shift reflects how deeply repetition has structured collective timing. As you walk with them away from the basin, the landscape feels subtly transformed in perception, not physically, but cognitively. Paths are more recognizable, distances feel more predictable, the environment has become legible through repetition. One intriguing observation from early cognitive research suggests that repeated travel through stable routes leads to segmentation of spatial memory, where long distances are stored as sequences of familiar segments rather than continuous unknown space. You experience this segmentation as the journey feels lighter in awareness. The return is quieter than arrival. There is less observation, less adjustment, movement is steady and confident. Salt, carried in measured loads, reinforces the purpose of the journey even as it fades from immediate attention. A widely supported interpretation in environmental archaeology suggests that repeated resource cycles contribute to the formation of stable movement corridors, which later evolve into early exchange routes when intergroup contact increases. You're still before exchange here, but the structure of circulation is already visible. As evening approaches, the group settles into familiar patterns. Fire is prepared, loads are organized. Salt is placed carefully among other gathered materials. Its position reflects importance without needing symbolic explanation. One lesser-known observation from early domestic archaeology suggests that repeatedly used essential materials often become spatial anchors within group organization, shaping how temporary living spaces are arranged even before formal settlement appears. You can feel that anchoring quietly in how everything is placed. Night begins to settle over the landscape again. The fire dims into a steady glow, voices lower. The group rests within a rhythm that has been reinforced through countless repetitions of gathering and return. Salt is no longer just part of survival, it is part of continuity, shaping how time, movement, and memory quietly align in early human life. You continue deeper into a world where repetition has become so consistent that it begins to feel like a natural law rather than a human behavior. Nothing here is sudden anymore. Even change arrives slowly, layered over countless cycles of return, gathering, and rest. Salt remains at the center of this rhythm, but now its influence is less about individual survival moments and more about shaping long-term patterns of life. You are walking again with the same group, and something subtle has shifted in how they move through space. Their path is no longer just remembered. It feels stabilized, as if the land itself has been gently edited by repeated passage. Dust is finer along the most traveled routes. Stones appear more exposed where feet have consistently disturbed the surface. The environment is quietly recording human presence. A widely supported interpretation in environmental archaeology suggests that repeated human movement along resource corridors can physically modify terrain over time, creating early traces of pathway formation long before formal infrastructure exists. You are witnessing this process in its earliest and most organic form. There are no roads here, but there are beginnings of them. The group approaches a familiar salt-bearing area, and the reaction is almost understated now. There is no need for search or hesitation. Recognition happens early, almost instinctively. People begin to spread into positions that feel rehearsed through repetition, each individual occupying a role that has been shaped by countless prior visits. One lesser-known observation from anthropological field studies suggests that repeated cooperative engagement in resource extraction often produces what researchers describe as behavioral convergence, where group members independently adopt similar action patterns without explicit instruction. You can see that convergence here in how seamlessly the group distributes itself across the site. Tools begin their familiar work. The scraping sound returns, steady and unbroken, like a quiet rhythm embedded in the landscape. Salt is loosened from the ground in small fragments, gathered and transferred with practiced care. There is no experimentation anymore, only refinement. Every motion has been simplified through repetition. There is ongoing academic discussion about whether this type of behavioral refinement should be understood as early technological efficiency or as cognitive adaptation to environmental predictability. In either case, what is clear is that the group expends less mental effort on the act of gathering and more on maintaining awareness of surroundings and timing. As you move among them, you notice how attention is now layered rather than divided. Some individuals remain fully engaged in extraction, while others continuously scan the perimeter and shifting light patterns across the terrain. This separation of perceptual focus has become stable enough that it no longer requires coordination. It simply exists. A commonly accepted interpretation in behavioral ecology suggests that repetitive group tasks in stable environments often lead to emergent specialization of attention, where individuals naturally adopt complementary roles based on perceptual preference and experience. You can feel this structure functioning without words. The SALT site itself no longer feels like a discovery location. It feels like a known point in a wider system of movement. Even when not present here, the group seems to carry awareness of it. This creates a sense that the landscape is no longer random. It is organized through memory. One intriguing observation from cognitive anthropology suggests that repeated return to fixed environmental locations can produce mental spatial anchoring, where specific sites become reference points for broader navigation and planning. You're inside that anchoring now. The group's movement across the world is quietly structured by remembered points like this one. As collection continues, storage behavior becomes even more precise. Containers are arranged not only for carrying, but for stability during movement. Weight distribution is considered instinctively. Materials are protected from contamination without needing the explicit reasoning. Practical experience has replaced trial and error. A widely supported view in material culture studies suggests that repeated handling of sensitive resources often leads to early forms of procedural knowledge, where correct methods are retained through bodily memory rather than verbal instruction. You can see this embodied knowledge in every action performed here. The day progresses slowly, marked only by shifts in light and shadow. There is no urgency in the group's activity. Salt is gathered steadily, without rush or pause. This consistency itself is significant. It reflects confidence in the repeatability of the process. There is ongoing academic debate about whether such stable resource cycles contributed more to economic development or to social cohesion in early human groups. Some researchers emphasize the material benefits of predictable supply, while others highlight the way repeated shared activity strengthens group identity. Both forces appear intertwined here. At one moment, a slight variation in ground texture draws attention. The group adjusts almost immediately, shifting focus toward a richer patch of deposit. This responsiveness is not directed by any individual. It emerges collectively, shaped by the shared sensitivity to environmental cues. One lesser-known observation from ethnographic modelling suggests that long-term engagement with consistent resource environments can produce group-level perceptual calibration, where members become attuned to similar environmental signals with increasing accuracy over time. You can observe that calibration in action. As the sun begins to move lower, the rhythm of gathering naturally slows. There is no command to stop. Instead, the activity tapers as if responding to an internal threshold of completion. Salt containers are checked, balanced, and prepared for transport. A commonly accepted interpretation in prehistoric studies suggests that repeated cyclical labour patterns often develop implicit temporal awareness, allowing groups to recognise completion points in activity without external measurement of time. You are witnessing that awareness as the group transitions smoothly from work to departure. The return journey begins with minimal discussion. Movement is organised, but not spoken. Paths feel familiar underfoot. Even subtle variations in terrain are anticipated rather than reacted to. The landscape has become predictable through repetition, and predictability reduces cognitive load. One intriguing observation from early cognitive geography studies suggests that repeated traversal of stable routes leads to compression of spatial experience. Where long distances are mentally stored as short sequences of familiar segments, you experience this compression as the journey feels increasingly effortless. Salt, carried in measured quantities, reinforces the meaning of the journey even as attention shifts away from it. It is no longer the focus of observation. It is the reason behind the structure of movement itself. Its presence is embedded in every step without needing acknowledgement. There is ongoing academic discussion about whether repeated resource circuits in early human societies should be interpreted as precursors to trade networks or as entirely independent survival systems. What is evident here is that circulation is becoming stable enough to repeat indefinitely. As evening approaches, the group returns to a familiar resting arrangement. Fire is prepared with practiced ease. Materials are placed in consistent positions. Salt is stored carefully among other gathered resources, treated with quiet attention that reflects accumulated understanding of its importance. A lesser-known observation from early domestic archaeology suggests that repeated placement of essential materials within group living spaces often leads to spatial organization patterns that later influence settlement structure. You can sense the beginning of that spatial logic here. Night settles gently over the landscape once more. The fire burns low, voices are soft and infrequent. The group rests within a rhythm that no longer feels temporary. It feels stable, reinforced by countless repetitions of the same cycle. Salt is no longer just part of survival, nor even just part of movement. It is part of structure, shaping how early human life begins to organize itself through memory, repetition, and return. You move forward again into a world where repetition is no longer something you notice as separate events. It has become the background structure of life itself. The group no longer experiences each journey to salt as an isolated action. Instead, it feels like a continuation of something already in motion, something that has no clear beginning and no clear end. The land, the movement, and the memory of salt are now tightly woven together. You're walking along a familiar corridor of terrain. The ground is uneven but increasingly recognizable through repeated travel. Certain stones act as silent markers, not placed intentionally but remembered through association. A slight dip in the earth signals a turn. A cluster of darker soil indicates proximity to known gathering zones. Nothing is written, yet everything is read. A widely supported interpretation in environmental anthropology suggests that repeated movement across resource landscapes gradually produces cognitive mapping systems that function as proto-geographic knowledge, allowing groups to navigate complex terrain through memory alone. You're experiencing that system in operation. The group does not ask where to go, it remembers. The salt site appears again, not dramatically, but with quiet certainty. There is no moment of discovery, there is only arrival. The group spreads out with practiced ease, each person moving into positions shaped by countless prior visits. The pattern is so consistent now that it feels almost automatic. One lesser-known observation from ethnographic reconstruction suggests that repeated cooperative labour in stable environments often leads to what researchers describe as implicit spatial choreography, where group members naturally coordinate movement patterns without verbal instruction. You can see that choreography here in how smoothly the group distributes itself across the site. Tools begin their familiar rhythm again. The scraping sound is steady, almost soothing in its repetition. Salt is extracted in small fragments, gathered with care, and transferred into containers that have become increasingly standardized through use. There is no experimentation anymore, only refinement of technique shaped by accumulated experience. There is ongoing academic discussion about whether such refinement represents early technological development or simply behavioral efficiency emerging from repetition. What is clear in this moment is that effort has decreased, while precision has increased. The body knows what to do without needing instruction. As you move among the group, Attention feels distributed in a stable pattern. Some individuals remain focused entirely on extraction, while others maintain awareness of surrounding terrain and group spacing. This division is not a sign but persistent. Over time, it has become a reliable structure of cooperation. A commonly accepted interpretation in behavioral ecology suggests that repeated collective tasks often lead to emergent functional differentiation, where individuals naturally adopt complementary roles based on repeated success in certain perceptual or physical actions. You're witnessing that differentiation stabilize into routine. The environment itself feels increasingly familiar. Even subtle variations in ground texture are recognized quickly and interpreted correctly. The group no longer explores the site, it reads it. This reading is based on accumulated memory rather than immediate observation alone. One intriguing observation from cognitive anthropology suggests that repeated interaction with consistent environmental features can produce layered memory encoding, where spatial knowledge is stored not only as location but as sequence of action associated with that location. You see this layering in how each step of gathering unfolds predictably. Salt continues to accumulate steadily. The quantity is not overwhelming in any single moment, but over time it becomes substantial. The importance of this accumulation is not spoken, yet it is understood through behavior. Care increases as quantity increases. Storage becomes more deliberate. Movement becomes more measured. A widely supported view in early material culture studies suggests that repeated handling of essential but environmentally sensitive resources often leads to the development of preservation-oriented behavior long before formal understanding of material properties exists. Salt naturally encourages this kind of learning through consequence. The day moves forward with slow consistency. Light shifts across the basin, marking time not in units but in gradual change. The group responds to these changes without discussion. Activity continues while light is strong and tapers as it softens. Time is becoming environmental rather than abstract. There is ongoing academic debate about whether early human temporal awareness developed primarily through environmental cycles or through social coordination demands. In this setting, both influences appear to merge. Salt gathering requires timing, repetition, and return, all of which reinforce cyclical awareness. At one point, a subtle variation in deposit density draws collective attention. Movement adjusts immediately. There is no hesitation, no discussion. The group responds as a unified perceptual system. This responsiveness is not directed but shared. One lesser-known observation from field anthropology suggests that long-term engagement with stable resource environments can lead to what researchers describe as shared environmental attunement, where group members independently develop similar perceptual thresholds for identifying resource variation. You're witnessing that attunement operating seamlessly. As gathering slows, preparation for departure begins without interruption. Containers are checked, redistributed, and secured. The weight of collected salt is balanced across carriers. These adjustments are made instinctively, reflecting accumulated physical knowledge of transport over repeated journeys. A commonly accepted interpretation in prehistoric logistics studies suggests that repeated transport of essential resources contributes to the early development of load management strategies, where efficiency emerges through repeated trial and bodily adaptation rather than conceptual planning. You can feel that adaptation in every adjustment made. The transition from gathering to departure is smooth. There is no break in rhythm. Activity simply shifts form. This fluidity suggests that the entire cycle has been internalized. Arrival, extraction, consolidation, and return are now part of a single continuous structure as you walk with them away from the salt basin. The terrain feels increasingly familiar, not in a visual sense alone, but in how movement unfolds. Steps are placed with confidence, turns are anticipated. The landscape has been mentally segmented through repetition into recognizable units. One intriguing observation from cognitive geography research suggests that repeated traversal of stable routes leads to the formation of hierarchical spatial memory, where large distances are compressed into sequences of familiar segments. You experience this compression as the journey feels shorter than it once did. Salt carried within the group reinforces the meaning of the movement. Even as attention shifts away from it, it is no longer actively observed. It is assumed. Its presence structures the purpose of travel without requiring focus. There is ongoing academic discussion about whether such stable, cyclical movement systems represent early economic behavior or simply optimize survival routines. What is clear is that the circulation has become consistent enough to repeat without disruption. As evening approaches, the group returns to a familiar resting arrangement. Fire is prepared with practiced efficiency. Materials are placed in consistent positions. Salt is stored carefully among other gathered resources, with attention that reflects accumulated familiarity rather than novelty. A lesser-known observation from early domestic archaeology suggests that repeated spatial organization of essential materials within temporary settlements often leads to emergent structural consistency, which later influences permanent settlement design. You can sense the early formation of that consistency here. Night settles once again over the landscape, the fire burns steadily. Conversation is minimal and calm. The group rests within a rhythm that no longer feels constructed. It feels natural, as if it has always existed. Salt is no longer just part of survival, nor only part of movement. It has become part of rhythm itself, shaping how early human life organizes time, space, and repetition into something increasingly still. You are now moving through a stage of this long human journey where repetition has become so deeply embedded that it no longer feels like action. It feels like structure. The group does not decide to return to salt sites anymore in any conscious sense. They simply continue a cycle that has already proven itself through countless repetitions: movement, gathering, return, rest, turn. Each phase flows into the next with increasing certainty. You walk with them across terrain that is no longer experienced as unknown. Even when the landscape changes in detail, it does not feel unfamiliar in function. Dry ridges, shallow basins, and mineral streaks are all interpreted quickly through accumulated memory. The world is being read through patterns rather than isolated features. Archaeological evidence consistently indicates that early human mobility systems often stabilized around repeated environmental resource points, particularly where predictable mineral deposits created reliable return incentives. You can feel this stabilization here as lived behavior. The group is not navigating a landscape, and it is following a remembered system. The salt site appears once again, but the emotional tone of arrival has softened even further. There is no anticipation, no surprise, and very little verbal communication. Instead, there is immediate transition into action. The group disperses into familiar positions, each individual occupying a role that has been reinforced through repetition over many cycles. One recurring finding in prehistoric research shows that repeated cooperative labor in fixed environmental zones often leads to emergent spatial coordination, where group members independently optimize their positioning based on environmental familiarity rather than instruction. You are seeing that optimization unfold in real time as movement begins without hesitation. Tools engage the ground in steady, controlled rhythms. The scraping sound has become part of the environmental soundscape itself. It no longer stands out. It blends with wind, distant movement, and the subtle shifting of heat across the surface. Salt extraction has become almost indistinguishable from the environment it operates within. There is no experimentation now, only refinement. Each motion reflects accumulated experience. Each gesture is the result of previous outcomes being silently absorbed into behavior. What once required attention now requires only continuation. Interpretations remain divided regarding whether such behavioral stabilization in early human groups should be viewed as the foundation of technological development or as a byproduct of adaptive efficiency under environmental constraints. In either case, the outcome is the same. Effort decreases while consistency increases. As you move among the group, you notice how awareness is distributed in a stable and predictable structure. Some individuals remain fully focused on extraction, others maintain broader environmental awareness. A few shift fluidly between both states depending on subtle cues in movement and sound. This distribution is not assigned, it is learned through repetition. One frequently cited model in anthropological studies suggests that long-term engagement in repetitive cooperative tasks leads to the emergence of functional perceptual roles, where individuals naturally specialize in different aspects of shared attention. You can observe that specialization functioning without explicit agreement. The environment itself feels increasingly integrated into this system of behavior. Certain areas of the salt basin are consistently favored. Others are consistently ignored. These patterns are not enforced. They emerge from repeated success and failure across many cycles. Geography is becoming categorized through use. A commonly referenced observation in environmental archaeology points out that repeated interaction with unevenly distributed resources often leads to cognitive classification of terrain based on utility rather than appearance. You are witnessing that classification develop here in real time. Salt continues to accumulate in measured quantities. The group does not treat this accumulation as exceptional anymore. It is expected. Yet despite this normalization, careful handling remains consistent, storage is organized, loads are balanced, nothing is wasted unnecessarily. Experience has refined efficiency. There is ongoing academic discussion about whether such refinement in early human material handling represents the origin of logistical thinking or simply the gradual reduction of error through repetition. What is clear is that the system becomes more stable with each cycle. The day progresses with minimal variation. Light shifts, heat rises and falls, and activity adjusts accordingly. There is no need for instruction. The group responds collectively to environmental change. Time is no longer tracked in abstract terms. It is experienced through transformation in surroundings. One lesser discussed finding in cognitive anthropology suggests that repeated environmental engagement can lead to the development of implicit temporal awareness, where cycles of activity align naturally with external rhythms without conscious measurement. You can feel that alignment here in how smoothly transitions occur. At one point, a subtle variation in ground texture draws immediate collective attention. The response is instantaneous. Movement adjusts without hesitation. This reaction is not coordinated verbally. It emerges from shared perceptual sensitivity built through repetition. As gathering continues, the structure of cooperation remains stable. Individuals move through familiar roles without deviation. There is no need for negotiation or instruction. The system regulates itself through experience. Interpretations remain divided regarding whether this level of coordination in early human groups should be understood as proto-social organization or simply as efficient behavioral adaptation to repeated environmental exposure. In practice, both interpretations converge into the same observable outcome. You begin to notice that even rest periods within the cycle are structured. Breaks occur in similar locations. Movements during rest are predictable. Even silence has rhythm. The entire system is becoming patterned not only in action but in pause. One recurring finding in field anthropology suggests that repeated exposure to stable environmental cycles often leads to the internalization of behavioral timing, where groups unconsciously synchronize activity and rest with environmental cues. You are witnessing that synchronization across the group. As the sun begins its descent, activity gradually slows. This transition is not abrupt, it is gradual and shared. Tools are set aside, containers are secured. final checks are performed with practiced care, Salt is prepared for transport with increasing efficiency. A commonly cited model in prehistoric logistics research suggests that repeated transport of essential resources contributes to the emergence of early load balancing strategies, where physical distribution of weight becomes optimized through accumulated bodily experience. You can see this optimization in every adjustment made before departure. The return journey begins without interruption. There is no discussion or delay. Movement is continuous. The landscape feels increasingly familiar, not because it has changed, but because it has been experienced repeatedly. Recognition precedes observation. One frequently referenced observation in cognitive geography research suggests that repeated traversal of stable routes leads to compression of spatial experience, where distance is mentally segmented into familiar intervals rather than perceived as continuous unknown space. You experience this compression as movement feels lighter and more predictable. Salt, carried in distributed loads, reinforces the structure of the journey without requiring active attention. It is present, but not central to awareness. Its importance is embedded in behavior rather than thought. There is ongoing academic discussion about whether such stable, cyclical movement systems should be considered early economic structures or purely ecological adaptations. What is increasingly clear is that circulation has become self-sustaining. As evening approaches again, the group returns to a familiar resting arrangement. Fire is prepared, materials are placed in consistent spatial order. Salt is stored carefully among other resources, handled with quiet consistency that reflects long familiarity. One lesser-known observation from early domestic archaeology suggests that repeated spatial organization of essential materials within temporary settlements often leads to emergent structural consistency, which later influences permanent settlement design patterns. You can sense the early formation of that consistency here. Night settles over the landscape once more. The fire burns steadily. Conversation is minimal. The group rests within a cycle that no longer feels like adaptation. It feels like continuity. Salt is no longer just part of survival or movement. It has become part of repetition itself, shaping how human life begins to stabilize into predictable rhythm across time, space, and memory. You move deeper into a phase of human time where repetition no longer feels like a pattern that was learned. It feels like something that has always been there, embedded in the ways the body moves through space and the way memory organizes experience. The group you travel with does not appear to be adapting anymore. It appears to be continuing. You walk across a landscape that is now strongly encoded in collective memory. Even subtle shifts in terrain are anticipated before they are fully seen. The ground rises slightly and the group adjusts direction. A dry channel appears ahead and movement naturally widens to avoid it. No one signals these changes. They are absorbed through repeated exposure to the same environmental logic. Environmental reconstruction data points toward a strong correlation between repeated resource site visitation and the emergence of stable spatial cognition in early human groups, particularly in regions where mineral deposits such as salt were unevenly distributed. You can feel this correlation here as lived structure rather than abstract idea. The group does not interpret the land. It recognizes it. The salt site returns once more, and the familiarity is now almost complete. Arrival is not an event. It is a transition point within a continuous loop. Movement slows only long enough to reorganize into familiar positions, and then extraction begins immediately. There is no need for observation or reassessment. One widely discussed model in prehistoric behavioral studies suggests that repetitive cooperative resource extraction leads to the development of stable action sequences, where individuals perform tasks in highly predictable order without requiring instruction or correction. You can observe those sequences functioning seamlessly across the group. The sound of scraping stone against mineral crust has become deeply familiar. It no longer draws attention. It blends into the ambient rhythm of the environment. Salt is gathered through motions that feel increasingly automatic, shaped by countless repetitions that have refined both efficiency and coordination. Interpretations remain divided regarding whether such high levels of behavioral consistency should be viewed as early evidence of structured labor systems, or simply as the natural outcome of repeated survival practice in resource-predictable environments. In either case, the observable effect is the same. Action becomes streamlined. You move through this group and notice that attention is now almost fully distributed without conflict. Individuals no longer overlap unnecessarily. Space is shared intuitively. Even small adjustments in position are mirrored by others without conscious coordination. This creates a fluid working field that feels almost self-organized. A frequently referenced observation in cognitive anthropology suggests that long-term engagement in shared environmental tasks can produce collective perceptual alignment, where group members begin to interpret spatial cues in highly similar ways due to repeated co-experience. You can feel that alignment shaping every movement here. Salt continues to accumulate in steady quantities. There is no sense of abundance or scarcity in the moment itself. Only continuation. Containers are filled gradually and transferred with practiced care. Each motion reflects a balance between effort and familiarity, between attention and memory. One lesser-known finding in ethnographic modelling suggests that repetitive handling of essential materials often leads to embodied optimization, where physical efficiency improves not through instruction, but through accumulated repetition stored in motor memory. You can see this embodied optimization in how smoothly tasks unfold. The landscape surrounding the site no longer feels separate from the group's activity, it feels integrated into it. Certain areas are consistently used, others consistently bypassed. These patterns are not enforced. They emerge naturally from repeated success and accumulated experience. There is ongoing academic discussion about whether such environmental structuring should be interpreted as early territorial awareness or simply as functional adaptation to resource distribution. What is clear is that space is becoming categorized through use rather than description. As the gathering continues, you notice subtle coordination in how resources are handled. Load distribution is adjusted without instruction. Containers are balanced with increasing precision. Movement becomes more efficient not because it is planned, but because it has been practiced. A commonly cited interpretation in early economic anthropology suggests that repeated cycles of resource collection and transport contribute to the gradual emergence of logistical reasoning, where efficiency is refined through accumulated physical experience rather than abstract planning. You are witnessing that refinement in motion. The day progresses with steady predictability. Light changes, but activity does not very significantly. The group operates within a rhythm that now feels independent of individual decision-making. It is as if the cycle itself is directing behavior. One recurring finding in environmental cognition studies suggests that repeated exposure to stable resource environments can lead to temporal entrainment, where groups unconsciously align activity patterns with environmental cycles such as daylight, temperature shifts, and resource visibility. You can sense that entrainment in how naturally the group slows as conditions change. At a moment of subtle variation in ground texture, attention shifts immediately. There is no verbal cue. Movement adjusts instantly across multiple individuals. This shared responsiveness indicates a highly developed sensitivity to environmental signals. Interpretations remain divided regarding whether such sensitivity should be viewed as the foundation of early collective intelligence or as an emergent property of repeated cooperative survival activity. In practice, both perspectives converge in observable behavior. You begin to notice that even rest intervals are structured through repetition. The group pauses in similar formations. Movement during rest follows recognizable patterns. Even silence carries rhythm. The entire system operates within a stable cycle of action and pause. One lesser discussed observation in early behavioral research suggests that repeated environmental cycles can produce internalized timing systems, where groups develop unconscious awareness of when to transition between activity phases based solely on accumulated experience. You can observe that timing system functioning here. As the sun lowers, the gathering phase gradually concludes. This transition is smooth and unspoken. Tools are set aside, containers are checked. Salt is secured with careful attention. There is no urgency, only completion of a familiar stage. A widely supported model in prehistoric logistics research suggests that repeated transport of essential materials leads to the gradual development of load management intelligence, where efficiency in carrying and distribution emerges through bodily adaptation over time. You can see that intelligence reflected in every adjustment made before departure. The return journey begins without delay. Movement is continuous. The landscape feels increasingly familiar, not because it has changed, but because it has been experienced repeatedly. Recognition now precedes perception. The group moves through memory as much as through space. One frequently referenced observation in cognitive geography suggests that repeated traversal of stable routes leads to segmentation of spatial experience, where distance is mentally divided into familiar units, rather than perceived as continuous unknown terrain. You feel this segmentation in the ease of movement. Salt, distributed among carriers, reinforces the structure of the journey without requiring attention. It is no longer central in perception, yet it remains central in function. Its presence defines the purpose of movement even when it is not actively considered. There is ongoing academic discussion about whether such stable cyclical systems represent the earliest form of structured economic behavior or remain within the domain of ecological adaptation. Increasingly, evidence suggests that these categories overlap significantly in early human contexts. As evening approaches, the group returns to its familiar resting arrangement. Fire is prepared. Materials are placed in consistent spatial order. Salt is stored carefully among the other gathered resources, treated with quiet precision shaped by a repeated experience. One lesser-known observation from early domestic archaeology suggests that repeated spatial organization of essential materials within temporary settlements contributes to the emergence of standardized domestic layouts, which later influence permanent settlement architecture. You can sense the earliest form of that standardization here. Night settles over the landscape once again. The fire burns steadily. Voices are low and infrequent. The group rests within a rhythm that no longer feels constructed or learned. It feels continuous, as if it has always existed. Salt is no longer simply part of survival or movement. It has become part of continuity itself, shaping how early human life stabilizes into rhythm across time, space, and collective memory. You move forward one final time into a phase of this long human journey where repetition is no longer something that can even be separated from existence. It is no longer a pattern observed from the outside. It is the structure through which experience is organized. The group you have been walking with no longer appears to be moving through a landscape. It appears to be expressing a rhythm that the landscape itself now accommodates. You walk with them across terrain that feels fully integrated into memory. Every slope, every basin, every dry stretch of earth is already known before it is seen. Not because the land has stopped changing, but because change itself has been catalogued through endless repetition. The group no longer interprets the environment, it anticipates it with quiet certainty. Archaeological synthesis from long-duration settlement studies consistently shows that when early human groups repeatedly interact with unevenly distributed essential resources, such as salt, their spatial cognition gradually shifts from reactive navigation to predictive environmental modelling. You are witnessing that shift in its most complete form. The world is no longer unknown, it is accepted. The salt site appears again, but even the concept of appearance feels unnecessary now. There is no arrival. There is no discovery. There is only continuation of a cycle that has become indistinguishable from life itself. The group disperses into action without hesitation, each movement unfolding as part of a sequence that has been refined over countless repetitions. One widely recognized interpretive model in behavioral archaeology suggests that sustained cooperative engagement in stable environmental contexts can lead to full procedural integration of labor, where complex task systems are encoded entirely in embodied memory and executed without conscious deliberation. You can observe this integration here in every motion, every adjustment, every transfer of material. The sound of tools working against mineral crust continues in a steady rhythm that no longer stands apart from the environment. It merges with wind, heat, and distant movement until it becomes indistinguishable from the natural soundscape. Salt extraction is no longer an activity within the world. It is part of how the world is experienced. Interpretive frameworks in anthropology propose that such extreme behavioral regularity may represent the earliest foundation of structured technological systems, while alternative ecological models suggest it is simply the outcome of a repeated adaptation to predictable resource distribution in this moment. Both interpretations describe the same quiet reality of efficiency without friction. You move among the group and notice that spatial organization is no longer maintained. It simply exists. Individuals occupy positions that feel inevitable, shaped not by instruction but by accumulated familiarity. The working field is stable, balanced, and self-sustaining. No one adjusts it because nothing needs adjustment. Cross-cultural comparative studies of early societies point toward the idea that long-term participation in repetitive environmental labor can lead to distributed perceptual alignment, where group members independently converge on similar interpretations of environmental signals due to repeated shared exposure. You can feel that alignment functioning continuously in every coordinated movement. Salt continues to accumulate, but accumulation has lost any sense of progression. It is perceived instead as maintenance of continuity. Each container filled is not a change in state but a reinforcement of what already is. The system does not grow in perception, it persists. Some interdisciplinary research proposes an alternative reading in which repetitive engagement with essential materials produces embodied optimization, where physical actions become increasingly efficient through cumulative motor adaptation stored in long-term procedural memory. You can see that optimization in the near effortless precision of every gesture. The surrounding environment is now entirely categorized through use history. Certain ground areas are consistently productive, others consistently ignored. This categorization is not conscious, it is embedded in movement. The landscape is no longer neutral, it is functional through memory. Evidence from long-duration settlement data suggests that repeated interaction with unevenly distributed resources contributes to the formation of spatial abstraction in early human cognition. Where environmental understanding becomes structured around utility patterns rather than visual appearance, you're witnessing that abstraction fully formed in behavior. As gathering continues, attention remains evenly distributed across the group. Some individuals focus on extraction, others on environmental awareness, and others on load distribution. These roles are not assigned. They are stabilized through repetition until they feel permanent. A widely discussed theoretical model in behavioral ecology suggests that long-term cooperative engagement in shared environmental tasks can lead to emergent attentional synchronization, where group members independently align perception of environmental cues due to repeated co-experience. You can observe that synchronization operating without interruption. The day moves forward without variation in structure. Light shifts across the basin, and activity adjusts naturally in response. There is no need for coordination because environmental rhythm itself has become sufficient guidance. Time is no longer tracked, it inherent. Longitudinal environmental studies suggest that repeated exposure to cyclical natural patterns can produce internal temporal alignment in early human groups, allowing synchronization of collective activity phases without formal measurement systems. You can feel that alignment embedded in every transition between action and pause, at a subtle variation in ground composition. Collective movement adjusts instantly. There is no hesitation or communication. The response is unified, immediate, and silent, reflecting deep familiarity with environmental structure and resource distribution. Interpretive debates remain unresolved regarding whether such group-level responsiveness should be understood as early collective cognition or as the convergence of individually optimized adaptive learning processes. What remains consistent is the absence of coordination failure. You begin to notice that even rest periods are structured in the same way as active labor. The group pauses in consistent formations. Movement during rest is minimal. Silence is patterned. Even stillness feels like part of the cycle rather than an interruption. One recurring observation in early behavioral research suggests that repeated environmental cycles can lead to internalized phase recognition, where groups unconsciously detect transitions between activity states through accumulated sensory cues rather than explicit signals. You can sense that recognition guiding every shift here. As the sun begins to lower, activity tapers without instruction. The reduction is gradual and shared across the group. Tools are set down, containers are checked. Salt is secured with practice's precision that requires no thought. The system transitions on its own. A widely cited model in prehistoric logistics research suggests that repeated transport of essential materials leads to embodied load optimization, where efficiency in carrying and distribution improves through accumulated repetition encoded in motor and spatial memory. You can see this optimization reflected in every movement preparing for return. The return journey begins seamlessly. Movement continues without interruption. The landscape feels entirely familiar, not because it is static, but because it has been experienced so often that it now exists as layered memory rather than immediate sensation. One commonly referenced observation in spatial cognition research suggests that repeated traversal of stable routes leads to segmentation of environmental experience, where long distances are mentally organized into familiar units rather than perceived as continuous unknown space. You feel this segmentation shaping every step of the journey. Salt, distributed among carriers, no longer requires attention. It is embedded in motion and purpose. It defines width-scanned structure without occupying awareness. The group moves within it, around it, through it. There is ongoing academic discussion about whether such stable cyclical systems represent the earliest form of structured economic behavior or remain within adaptive ecological frameworks. Increasing evidence suggests that these categories overlap significantly in early human development. As evening approaches, the group returns to its familiar resting arrangement. Fire is prepared. Materials are placed in consistent spatial order. Salt is stored carefully among other gathered resources, handled with quiet precision shaped entirely by repetition. One lesser-known observation from early domestic archaeology suggests that repeated spatial organization of essential materials within temporary settlements contributes to emergent structural consistency, which later influences permanent architectural planning and settlement design. You can sense that consistency fully stabilized now across daily life. Night settles over the landscape once more. The fire burns steadily. Voices are minimal and calm. The group rests within a rhythm that no longer feels constructed or maintained. It feels continuous, as if it has always existed and will continue without interruption. Salt is no longer part of survival or movement. It is no longer even part of memory in the usual sense. It has become part of continuity itself, shaping how early human life stabilizes into rhythm across time, space, and shared existence. And as everything grows quieter, what remains is not discovery anymore, but recognition that the simplest elements of the earth can quietly organize the deepest structures of human life without ever needing to be understood. You're no longer moving through events, you are simply resting inside them as they dissolve into quiet continuity. The fire from earlier moments is no longer vivid, it is only a soft afterglow in memory, like warmth that remains after the source has already disappeared. The rhythm that once felt like movement across landscapes has now softened into something gentler. There is no longer a sense of journey, no sense of arrival or return, only repetition fading into stillness, like waves that no longer break but simply linger in place. Salt, once the quiet force shaping paths, decisions, and survival, no longer feels separate from anything. It is no longer an object, nor even a necessity you can point to. It has become part of the background logic of life itself, the invisible structure that allowed everything else to take form without ever demanding attention. You might notice how thoughts begin to slow now, not because anything is ending abruptly, but because everything is settling into its most natural state. The mind does not need to follow routes anymore. There are no more routes to follow. What remains is a soft awareness of continuity, as if all those repeated journeys, all those gathered moments, and all those silent returns are folded into a single long breath that never fully ends. And in that quiet space, you can let go of detail, let go of structure, let go of movement. Everything has already been carried far enough. There is nothing more to follow now, nothing more to complete, only rest. And the gentle sense that even the smallest grain of salt once helped shape the long, invisible architecture of human life. Sweet dreams.